Good morning. So these are not some easy text for my first sermon with y'all at Good Shepherd. Before I get too far, we need to stop and talk about the elephant that is in the room. In the first line of our gospel, we get the word divorce. A wise theology professor once said, "Divorce already has a sermon written when it's said in church." And there's so many assumptions that are built into one little word. And as your new clergy person for pastoral care and newcomers, I want to preach a different sermon that may challenge that, may affirm that, but I hope is not filled with shame or guilt, but one about love. One that is not about assumptions, but an opportunity to start a long, evolving conversation with you all. First, I'm not someone who's been divorced, nor have I even been married, but I do know the choice to end a marriage or a relationship, regardless of the circumstances, often has some pain and loss mixed in. So I believe a better way to think of this word, to get to the heart of the context of our gospel this morning, is to think about vulnerable people. People whose pain lives on their sleeves for everyone to see. Pain that is written onto their bones that may not be able to be seen at first glance. All these different kinds of vulnerability. I'm sure when we think about vulnerability, we all have someone who comes to mind. Maybe it's the people affected by Hurricane Helene. Maybe it's people who experience violence, addiction, or chronic illness. And maybe, if we're brave enough, we can remember a time when we too were that vulnerable. And in Jesus' time, divorced women were some of the most vulnerable people, especially in Jewish culture. Women were not individual humans, but property of their fathers or husbands. And marriage was not a loving commitment between two persons, but it was a business transaction. And divorced women in particular had no place to live, no community to call home, and no way to support themselves or their children. Divorced women in Jesus' time were totally and utterly vulnerable. And the Pharisees, good church people like you and me, know all of this, but they're not seeing the helplessness in their midst. They're trying to entrap Jesus, as the first line says, but Jesus does not play this game. Instead, Jesus continues to shift away from their abstract debate and beg them to consider their fragility. So let me even talk about Jesus' own vulnerability in this particular section in Mark. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And when Jesus gets there and the journey from Galilee finally ends, Jesus knows. Jesus knows he will be nailed to that cross. Jesus understands that only for a little while longer he will be made lower to live and walk among God's people. And the disciples, the Pharisees, and all the people still don't seem to understand Jesus' openness and willingness to give all of himself. No exceptions, just for them and us. So I imagine Jesus is trying to tell this story in Mark with some urgency. Jesus uses these two examples bookended in our gospel of vulnerable people. First with divorced women, and then with little children. He's trying to build this relationship with his followers where Jesus shows the importance of vulnerability, the fragility of being human. He even calls out the Pharisees and good old church folk like you and me who sometimes forget that we are not superhuman. Jesus says, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. Another way to say this in our modern dialect is because of your susceptibility to judge, because of your own fragility, God wrote this commandment for you. Jesus is saying we're not going to be perfect, nor does Jesus accept that or want that for us. We might get off on the wrong foot, but Jesus is holding the Pharisees and people like us to remind us to try their best to start a relationship in good faith. Jesus keeps pointing us back to ourselves. What did Moses command you? This commandment for you. Jesus cannot build a relationship with Pharisees or us if we hide behind a facade of abstract concepts or build a wall to prevent meaningful conversations. So as I preach my very first sermon here at Good Shepherd and begin to build this relationship with my new church family, especially as your clergy person dedicated to pastoral care, I'm going to try to tear down this preaching wall and ask and help make a place that starts a conversation and show you my own vulnerability, where the pain I have lives on my sleeves. And as many of you are aware, I'm someone who loves art deeply. You can go inside my office, and I've begun to put up some of my favorites on the walls. And I'm sure some of you have noticed, whether as I've read the gospel or seen me out of these robes, that I've also permanently affixed some art onto my person with my tattoos. And to be clear, I'm not a person who only cares about aesthetics or whether or not it's pretty. To me, what I care about is the intention, the care, and the story behind the art. And this morning, I want to let you into the secret of my tattoos. On my left arm are all symbols of the greatest grief in my life. The marker of how death of those I've loved dear define who I am and how I show up in this world. The lotus flower that is on my upper left arm with a stem written always is the birth flower of my childhood best friend, Owen, who died almost 3 years ago. So I literally wear my pain on my sleeve. But the story does not end there. On my right arm, I have all these symbols of hope in my life. The joy of matching tattoos with some of my closest friends. But the tattoo that mirrors Owen's is a poppy written forever on the stem. And to me, it is a reminder of Isaiah 48. The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of our God will stand forever. Always and forever. And I got most of these tattoos while in seminary because it was important to me that in my ministry and development as a priest, that I can stand with those in their greatest grief and their greatest hope, and everything in between. So when I hold up and read the gospel, in my left hand, I hold grief. And in my right hand, I hold hope. And in December, when God willing, people consenting, I'm ordained a priest, I will consecrate those elements holding both the great grief and great hope and everything in between. This gospel this morning is so much more than a story of divorce or little children. It's a story of vulnerability and the love of a powerful Savior. A Savior that can hold all of our fragile selves, even when we forget we're not invincible. Our parable in Mark is a reminder of a Savior who takes us up in God's loving arms, lays their powerful hands upon us, and blesses us, always and forever. Amen.
Amen.